Welcome to Charity Village Connects. I'm Mary Barrow. With the release of Prime Minister Mark Carney's first federal budget since his election, we're turning our focus to what it means for the Canadian nonprofit sector. The new budget arrived in a tense economic climate with mounting global instability, a shifting labor and funding environment, declining donations, and increased demand for frontline services. Even while the Canadian economy is facing recessionary pressures, and economic instability caused by President Trump's tariffs. For charities and nonprofits, the stakes couldn't be higher. What does the budget hold for the nonprofit sector? Joining me to unpack this, please welcome Aline Nizigama, the CEO of YWCA Canada. Aline is a dynamic multilingual leader with extensive professional experience working with equity-deserving groups. She has almost a decade of experience in nonprofit leadership and has honed her research, policy, and strategic thinking expertise in both the social and public sectors. She has extensive experience in providing services for women, delivering affordable and supportive housing, grassroots organizing for feminist solidarity, and intersectionality. Welcome to the podcast, Aline.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you for having me.
And what parts of the budget are you most encouraged by, and why do you see them as meaningful steps forward?
Uh, Thank you for that question. I wanted to start with really explaining what YWCA Canada represents so that we can really better contextualize the parts of the budget that were really impactful for us. We are a leading voice for women, girls, and two-spirit and gender diverse people. And we are the oldest and largest organization providing services and advocacy to advance gender equity. And we've been doing this for over 150 years and really at the forefront of a movement to fight gender-based violence, to build affordable housing, provide high-quality, affordable childcare, advocate for economic equity, and really continue also to amplify the voices of youth and youth leadership. We work across 9 provinces and 2 territories in Canada, all collectively advancing gender equity by responding to community needs and local and national advocacy goals together for systemic change. So with that in mind, your question on which part of the budget were really impactful and meaningful, where we were just the parts around continuing to fund the women's sector with the funding for women and gender equality, that renewal, and the promises of ongoing funding. There was really a commitment to advance gender equity and supporting women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA plus people across Canada with what was tabled as stable long-term funding is a necessary investment to help eliminate discrimination and advance the rights of women and gender diverse people. So to me and to us in the sector, this investment in women's leadership, in economic opportunities, and efforts to end gender-based violence were and continue to be an essential part to building a more equitable and inclusive Canada. That was one of the biggest announcement that, as you know, was also made in a pre-budget fashion to reassure the sector that these issues continue to be important for this government. We did a fulsome analysis of the budget that you were all invited to see, to read on our website. This was the biggest part amongst many others. The second aspect was the funding that was announced in housing and the launch of Build Canada Homes as an agency that's going to help fast track building more affordable housing across Canada. This investment in affordable and on-market housing was seen as a positive and important step towards addressing housing insecurity. We all know and feel this, particularly for us, for single-parent families. Most of them are women. And we really look forward to working with the government to ensure that women and women-led families have long-term, safe, affordable, and deeply affordable place to call homes. We also saw that there is a renewed commitment to childcare and expanding early learning. And all these aspects were some of the most important for our work.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for adding that context. I think that's really important for the listener to understand what your perspective is on the issue of analyzing the budget. On the flip side, where do you believe that this budget misses the mark? And what will be the most real world implications for the organizations and the communities you serve?
Yeah. So YWCA Canada welcomed the federal commitment to some of the things that I just listed, including ending gender-based violence, and but we also noted the lack of additional funding for the continuation of the 10-year National Action Plan to end gender-based violence. And we say this because we are continue to be at a time when gender-based violence has reached crisis levels in Canada, and we hope there's opportunity to continue to address this and shape some of the subsequent steps in other parts of the government if it's multi-year, the government funding that is, and look forward to understand how some of the new investments will support measurable progress towards safety and prevention. We see this crisis continuing to rise. We just held a discussion about the need to continue to focus on ending gender-based violence. We are in a remembrance period when we reflect on the 14 lives that were taken at l'École Polytechnique in Montréal 3 decades ago. And so, but we see that the data shows that this issue continues to be at crisis levels. And so we want to work with the government on this. We also noted other critical gaps, which included a lack of new funding, as I said, to expand and enhance the Canada-wide early learning and childcare program. We know that accessible, affordable, community-based childcare is essential to women's economic participation. And in our analysis and in our pre-budget consultations, we called for a $500 million investment over 5 years to expand nonprofit and community-based childcare spaces, because we know that this is where you really get a lot of value add and get quality and continue to really focus on affordability for families. An additional aspect was also on the housing investment, because beyond housing, the budget includes limited long-term investment in social infrastructure that supports women's safety and well-being, again, adding to what I just said. And so while we recognize that the investments were there, we continue to see a need to expand on this. And last, we recognize investments in First Nations infrastructure, things like clean water, but we also call for actions on Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and the calls for justice that were also included in the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. These are some of the most important pieces that I think could be strengthened in new iterations of the federal government's funding.
Yes, we'll see what comes out in the coming months and year. I'm curious whether the reinstatement or maintenance of a dedicated minister for women and gender equality seems to be a strong signal for many in the sector. From YWCA Canada's viewpoint, what does having a dedicated minister mean in practice for accountability, resource allocation, and visibility of gender justice issues?
Yeah, first and foremost, it means that we value women's rights and women's lives as a priority issue as a society, point blank. And it means that we are seeing and we still have a visibility on the fact that there's still systemic and systematic discrimination based on gender and other intersections, things like race and age and sexuality. And we know that if we don't prioritize, if we don't name things, we don't actually focus on that. So having a dedicated ministry means having a dedicated home in government to address these issues and measure progress. And so as a network of organizations that collectively invest over $260 million annually and affecting over 1 million women and families, their children over the nation, we know that we are an important aspect of the Canadian society and economy. So as a network, we are also at the front line of addressing gender-based violence and supporting survivors and providing essential services like childcare, employment, counseling, and other related programs. We see the negative impact of what this continued discrimination does daily. And we know that we need to continue to put it back in the public sphere in conversations so that Canadians continue to see this as an urgent priority to address. Again, unless you name issues and address them accordingly, you can't measure outcomes. And so we hope that the reinstatement of women and gender equality as a department is an important part of this. And we also know that this, by prioritizing these areas, we are building a healthier society, an inclusive society, and a more prosperous economy.
Now, I note that in addition, at the same time of these sort of positive signals, your advocacy has raised alarm over proposed cuts or planned reductions within wage. Original reports suggest up to an 80% budget cut in departmental plans. How does YWCA Canada interpret this juxtaposition of stable funding framed in the budget versus deeper structural threats to gender equality infrastructure?
An organization, and alongside our other feminist and women's rights and gender equality partners and coalition collaborators, we were initially alarmed by some of those early analyses, and we did make our voice heard. And we know that that had an impact because we know that advocacy and continued raising of voices together has an impact. The announced funding that was then tabled was lower than in COVID funding levels, which we know were higher, but it still is that it was double what we were at pre-COVID levels. Which it's a thing to work with. It's something to start with, but we know that there is a continued need to work on an advocacy, on engaging our government to assess the needs in how this funding is actually going to have an impact and how these levels of funding, if they remain at this level, are going to be meeting the needs that are in community. And again, we know that those needs are so diverse and continue to shift with new technologies. If we're talking about gender-based violence, for example, we know that that's now, there's a new realm around online digital safety that we need to be talking about and addressing at elevated levels. So we hope that that means that we can also continue to provide a guidance to this government to addressing these needs. And I also add that we always, even when we have some funding, we have some commitments, there's a need to continue to have vigilance because we know that rights can be rescinded. We see this across the globe. We see this just south of the border of our country. And even rights that have been achieved and attained can be taken away by a change of government or a change of direction in policy. So that vigilance needs to be resourced. That vigilance needs to be, we have to have funding allocated that actually rises to the level at which we need to see. So if we're talking about safety, it's not just about how that safety is, if we're talking about the army or not, it's about safety in communities so that we also think about the impact on women across the different demographics that access our services.
Well, I want to now turn to the kind of advocacy that you've been successful with. I know that you engage in a lot of coalition work and advocacy with coalition. I mean, you mentioned the fact that the funding for these issues came in advance of the budget, and that I know resulted from a lot of advocacy for a number of groups. Could you share how that coalition advocacy shaped any of the outcomes we see in the budget and what you believe still remains to be won through a collective action?
Well, Mary, we know that there is strength in numbers. And as you know, as we were preparing for the budget, more than 400 organizations came together to have one voice and advocate for the reinstatement of the Women and Gender Equality Ministry and having a dedicated minister. in my own tradition, there's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And that is something that was at play here in this coalition work. Collective action to shape programs and policies that will come from this budget is going to be needed, and we need to see how the budget is going to be operationalized, how we're going to be conducting analysis, gender-based analysis plus GBA plus analysis on the rest of the budget in aspects such as defense, AI, resource extraction. We know there's a lot of ambitious projects in these areas, changes to immigration, the justice and law reforms, tax reforms, and all these things are going to have impact on women's and community lives. And so we want to come as a sector. We always convene and see and look together using the individual strengths and expertise that organizations have built over time to then all come together and say, here's what we see coming and here's what we would like to see. Because it's one thing to analyze and critique something that doesn't work. It's another to actually be providing a voice and an avenue to how things can be done differently. And we believe strongly on being able to shape how some of those programs and policies should actually be continued to be stewarded and developed and designed and co-designed with us in mind. And so we are a strong and mighty sector, and we will continue to be partners in delivery. We also continue to be a force in terms of holding the governments accountable on delivering the funding promised, also what is still lacking and addressing the gaps.
And I'm curious how you feel about. We talked earlier about the announcements in the investment in housing, and I want to dig down a little bit further into that. Can you speak to how these investments into housing will translate into in practice for your member affiliates, and what additional supports or whether there's caution flags YWCA is watching for?
Yes, we're happy to see this really increased focus on investment in housing. What continues to be a worry for YWCA Canada and our local YWCAs and other partners in the women's housing movement is a need for a carve out for women and families, recognizing that there is a connection between housing and the housing crisis that we see and intimate partner violence and gender-based violence in general. So one of the things that worked in previous iterations of the implementation of the national housing strategy was that there was a 25% carve out that was then where there was specific targeted funding pots that were allocated to the sector. We didn't see that, and we want to work with the government again to see some of that materialize in this implementation of this investment in housing. We need to see, and I know this was part of the announcements, a carve out for shelters and transitional housing specifically, because these are critical spaces where we help people who are in some of the most difficult positions, where it's often a question of life and death. And so we want to see that implemented. And we also want to have a commitment to deep affordability and to building things fast, to having innovative solutions that emerged from the wisdom of communities, and seeing as part of the building holistic service models. It's not just housing, but it's also all the other wraparound services that we need to have. And lastly, we also need to see a commitment to building more permanent housing and a commitment to keeping that affordability in perpetuity. Because we know that sometimes we build things and they are affordable, but then the market comes in, or that affordability is not protected over a long period of time. So we want to be able to ascertain that that's going to be part of this investment. All these are going to really strengthen the good things that we're seeing in how Build Canada Homes is signaling that it wants to work with community-based housing developers like the YWCA movement.
Now, I want to turn now to go into a little bit more detail of what you touched on earlier on in our discussion about the investment into social infrastructure, in particular, accessible, affordable, community based childcare. And as you mentioned, it remains critical for women's economic participation. And in your official response to the budget, you referred to the limited long term investment in social infrastructure. And how do you envision this impacting the women and families connected to YWCA's Canada's work? And how might the sector need to pivot accordingly in its support?
Mhm. YWCA Canada, to just put it in perspective, uh, is collectively the second largest provider of quality nonprofit childcare. And we do this because over time, we recognize this as a feminist issue. It allows women to join the workforce if they choose to. And we know that sometimes this is not an option. This economy is really hard, especially for single parents. And so it's a central aspect of the work that we do. And we think that, as this government has signaled, a generational budget should include enhanced funding for the expansion of what has become what is now called the $10 a day childcare program, and as well as the other early learning programs. In our analysis, we advocated again for the 500 for $500 million over 5 years to expand this program. And so we want to see this commitment. We worry about the long wait lists that continue to exist, people not having options or struggling to afford childcare, children not being set up to achieve their full potential, and women feeling stuck, especially the younger people that are facing real choice issues around affordability challenges and feeling like you have to choose of not having children. And so we know that ultimately this is not great for the economy. We use the Quebec case a lot because this was a study that has shown that every dollar invested has multiple folds of returns. The economic benefits of Quebec's childcare program really they extend beyond the immediate financial returns. This has not only helped bridge the pay gap, it improves the quality of life for young families, it reduces the number of children living in poverty, and its successes in Quebec really served as a model for the expansion nationally of this universal program. There's a lot of studies from emerging from Quebec that show that the implications, the successes and lessons from this program from the 90s can actually serve as a great example for continued and enhanced investments by the government. Just anecdotally, we know that in certain areas of Quebec where there was the biggest increase in childcare availability, mothers' employment went up by 67%, and the use of regulated childcare increased by 38%. Even when you account for other regional factors. And so there are researchers that also just really show the increased, every dollar invested in the returns, not just the financial, the monetary, but also the social and community well-being indicators that were affected. And so one of our partners, Childcare Now, is a coalition. Together, we believe, and we show up as a united voice, that based on some of these analysis, that this universally accessible early learning and childcare program yields so many benefits for children, for women, for parents, for communities, and for the economy. And our own public opinion polling data shows that Canadians also see this and agree that there's a need. It's very popular. Our data shows that 73% of Canadians get it and agree that this program needs to be not just maintained, but expanded and kept affordable so that we can all participate fully in the economy. So all these are things that we need to continue to have in mind. And I think the government really does need to see this. There's a lot of responsibility for the federal government to show up and support the sector in rising up to the occasion for parents.
Well, the YWCA Canada emphasizes what's known as gender responsive budgeting. How well do you feel the budget applied a GBA plus, gender based analysis plus approach? Did you see meaningful transparency or mechanisms to ensure gender equality is embedded across all the spending lines rather than only in designated departments?
Unfortunately, no. It was not well included or applied. It was very much limited to women and gender equality programs. And we see this as a miss. We also are disheartened by some of the recent remarks that we heard about uh, international development and retracting from supporting women's rights in on the global sphere. And we see this as not very encouraging. And I'm here to remind folks that feminism and having feminist policies is it's not a bad word. It's not a bad approach. It's actually about leveling the playing field and addressing historic and continuing systemic inequalities and the impact that those have on virtually every aspect of life. And we want to see this done. And we are actually committing, not just as a YWCA movement, but as a sector, to implementing an analysis, a GBA plus analysis on all aspects of the government of this budget. And we think that if the government is actually interested in learning more about this, they need to consult with communities. And I'm now reminded that we need to include Indigenous voices as well, because there are many areas of the budget where questions around sovereignty and commitments to consulting with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities was not respected. And so we want to ensure that that is done, because we know that this is how you get buy-in, you show respect, and you get more success. And so with if you're not implementing community-backed projects, you do not see success. You actually get a lot of pushback. So we want to be able to help, and we're here to do that.
Well, looking at the nonprofit and charitable sector more broadly, what signals from this budget should leaders and boards of charities, especially those working on gender equity, be looking for now? What should they do in response to this budget environment?
So we need to look at how we reorganize ourselves. We know that this is a new government. It's a continuation of previous governments, but it is a new tone. And we need to be able to translate our work in words and language that everybody can understand and support. In some of the work that happens in the nonprofit sector, we know that some of this is about translating our work in economic terms, for example. Uh, I'm saying this, but I know it's hard because we're not resourced to do this. We're in such a scarcity model where we are, facing some of the most difficult and complexity of issues in the community, that we don't always have the luxury to take time and translate these in economic terms, and we're going to have to. And I think it would be worthwhile to invest some resources to this work. We also know that this does not mean that we don't talk about the social returns as well. Things like community safety, community thriving, peace are going to continue to be important to highlight in our work. And so, as much as we translate the results and outcomes in quantitative and economic terms, we continue to need to have qualitative ways of measuring how our work is having an impact, how these investments stemming from this budget will be having an impact in the community. I think we also need to talk about collaborating more and think about how we could achieve bigger things together by getting out of the spirit of competition for scarce resources. This is something that the feminist sector really does exemplify well. And a last piece is that we also, as a sector, need to think beyond the government funding. This is challenging. We know we always want to hold the public purse accountable for the work that's happening in our communities, but we need to diversify funding and reach out to allies and partners in corporate Canada, engage individual donors and philanthropists, because this work does take everybody if we want to see real meaningful change at a systemic level.
And to wrap things up of our discussion today, thinking ahead, if you could speak directly to the federal government about the key next steps over the coming year from YWCA Canada's perspective, what would your top two priorities be to ensure that this budget's ambitions for gender equality are actually realized?
I think a lot of things that the government can do. The government needs to work with organizations that are experts in the frontline work, and the YWCA movement is a really good example. Again, we are old as Canada's confederation itself, and we've built real expertise in all the areas where we work, whether that is ending gender-based violence and through prevention and intervention, building women-led housing that includes the whole continuum of housing, shelters, transitional housing, and permanent affordable housing, championing childcare and women's well-being. That includes, again, programs like after school care, newcomer services, wellness programs like achieving economic equity, employment, reskilling, upskilling programs, and working with young people to secure inclusive futures. All of these are areas of expertise that we've built and that we think we do best, that we can help bring into conversations to support the government in achieving its own priorities. So that is the first area that I would highlight. The second is to really actually deliver on the commitment to cut the red tape and supporting the sector in not getting us mired in like really complicated funding applications or reporting structures, cumbersome processes to just get through the door and communicate our outcomes or get access to funding. We really don't see this as a best practice. And COVID actually shown us that we could get out of all that and actually continue to be effective. And so that is another area where the government needs to do better and do best. And the next area is to make it really simple. This building on my previous point, make it simple for us to have an impact. Not, that does not mean that it's not going to hold us to account, but we do need, there's a lot of energy that gets spent in accessing funding and in reporting on the outcomes that don't have to be complicated. I do think that having clear measures in place so that we can all actually look back and look at the successes is another area of strength. And lastly, we need the government to be thinking about sustainability for the sector. We are a big part, and when I say we, I mean not just the feminist sector, but the nonprofit sector and charitable sector. We're a big part of the GDP, and we are a big part of the workforce. The YWCA movement alone employs over 5,000 people collectively nationally. And that does not include jobs that are created when we are building houses, when we are just supporting the work that happens on the ground. And so that is additional jobs that we're talking about. We are voting blocks as well, and we are quite sensitive to how the government responds to our concerns, and we need to be respected as such. And so we think that keeping the sustainability of the sector in mind will actually help everybody and will create more inclusive societies that I know all Canadians want to live in. And thank you so much for having given me the opportunity to talk about this, and happy to continue the conversation as we move forward.
I'm very glad to hear that. I want to just focus on one last topic, and I think this is really about advice to other nonprofits and charities across Canada, based on the success of the collaborative work that you did in advocating with your other gender-based kind of organizations. I wonder if what advice would you like to give to the sector who might be searching for ways to be better heard by the federal government, but also, the provincial governments in which they operate as well. What what is your advice to them?
So I think some of the best ways of organizing that we've seen have an impact are about using every opportunity and avenue that you have, first and foremost. If we're looking at the local, municipal, provincial, and community level, it's about making sure you engage your elected officials. And that could be the people in current government, but it could also be the opposition. If it's an issue that is not being addressed and is actually being carried by a voice that's not currently in power, there are ways to engage in that direction. That is the one first advice. The second advice is about being relentless in asking for what we need. We understand the issues on the ground deeply. We do. We see them daily, and we know what it will cost to get us to a place where we have shorter wait lists, we have more impactful programs, and we have communities that work. And so by continuing to raise the voice when we don't see what we need on the ground is a good way to make sure that people know that we still care about these issues. And now we think that there is a role for our government to show up. The third and last piece is about, again, making sure you're not alone in a corner and going at it alone, and just really seeing, looking at how many other partners for whom this issue is important, and building those numbers together and building a stronger voice together. I think those have shown that will create platforms where we, the tables kind of change. It's not to toot our own horn, but I think it shows that when we are coming in numbers and saying this is not okay, this is a wrong way to look at this issue, we see a big pivot and fast pivots. And I think this is something that we need to continue to do. On the women and gender equality piece, what was disheartening to hear as we were headed into an election, built on what we see in elections south of the border, was that we heard that it was going to be a choice between the economy or supporting equity. We're like, well, you can't have those two separated. You can't have a thriving economy if you're not counting 51% of the voices. And you don't have to, actually. It's not an either or. It's not a zero-sum game. You can achieve everything, actually, in bigger ways by looking at things differently. And we're really, it was a collective wisdom. It was coming together with other sectors so that we are not all just in our own little corners, but saying, no, we can shape this issue and frame it in a way that actually serves all purposes. We can be worried about the economy, but also continue to do the work that we need to do so that we actually don't get deeper into economic issues that are going to be harder to address. And so all these are really good practices that actually make it easier also for the government to do its own part. And so I'm hopeful that the sector feels inspired and actually feels its power, because there's a lot of power there.
Well, thank you for being relentless on these really important issues and working with across many other organizations collaboratively to make sure that these important investments were made. And thank you for sharing your important insights into the federal budget and, of course, your wisdom and advice to other nonprofit leaders on the present and future challenges facing the Canadian charitable sector in these very uncertain times. Thank you for joining CharityVillage Connects.
Thank you so much, Barry. Thank you for having me and for having the voice of the sector at heart.